So every one of us is born with a capacity for shame. What's interesting that even a lot of psychopaths and narcissistic people also have a capacity for shame. They just react to it in a very funky way that gets them thrown in jail. In other words, probably 0.5% of people on the planet are psychopathic in a way that they actually don't even feel shame. But half of psychopaths, they do feel shame. They just react strangely. Same with narcissists. But we're all born with this capacity, and that's because it has served us in evolution. So Charles Darwin said, there can be no doubt that the tribe, including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over other tribes. In other words, in order to survive in our earlier evolution, we needed to stick together as a group. And when somebody diverged from that group, it was a danger to the group. And those people, and what a group would need to do is to actually, harm somebody to bring them back in. But shame actually feels really harmful. It feels so terrible that when people break the rules, they know they break the rules, they will feel so terrible that they will then try to get back into the good graces of the tribe. And so this is how shame works. Shame is actually is functional in the old days to bring us back into the group. Basically, shame refers to a kind of violation of the standards or rules of the group. Unfortunately, a lot of group rules are really unjust and arbitrary. And so when we deviate from the rules and feel terrible shame, it's actually not useful. But this is where it comes from. Shame is, that's you could say, the template. But when we have been consistently negatively treated, that predisposition that we have to feel shame becomes harmful. Developmentally, we see that babies, as early as 2.5 or 3 months old, if a mother looks at a child, like all of a sudden it's like this, unflinchingly, that's called the still face experiment. Children do 3 things. They get sad, they get angry, and they also show signs of shame, which means they slump in the chair, they turn their eyes downward, or they avert their gaze. So shame is triggered by a loss of connection, and it starts really early. Physiologically, shame triggers the bodily threat response, because at one point in our evolution, it really was a threat. And so all the same things happen in our bodies as if we were physically threatened. So there's increases in cortisol, pro-inflammatory cytokines. And short term, if we're actually in danger, these hormones are really good because they help us to deal with danger. But long term, if we're being triggered again and again and again by insults to our sense of self, and these threat responses in our body are getting activated again and again, this actually decreases our physical functioning. It leads to depression, heart disease, and all kinds of things. And neurologically, we also know that shame is associated with, when we feel shame, this part of the brain gets really active because shame is so hard to regulate that people activate their executive cortex more intensively, but they don't necessarily downregulate the amygdala, which is the part of us that responds to danger. So it creates a struggle for the brain. What you need to know is that in the general population, shame is a short-term state, and it's not a problem. However, it can become a trait. And when that happens, it negatively impacts our lives. And as I said, when shame is a trait, it is because of how we have been treated by others. And that means how we've been treated in our family of origin. So children, for example, when they're under stress, they will reach out to a caregiver. And ideally, the caregiver will provide kindness and compassion, comfort, soothe, do all those things, and then everything is well. However, when children reach out and their caregivers are unresponsive, sometimes they're even attack the children for reaching out, all that gets internalized. And that gets internalized as shame, which is, I'm not good enough, right? And also this is the case if a person experiences like severe neglect or trauma, definitely in childhood, definitely they will conclude something is wrong with me, okay? So we learn shame through our relationship with primary caregivers. And also, what we find is that shame is especially associated with trauma. So when a person has a trauma memory that becomes central to the personality, a shame memory that becomes central to the personality, it becomes traumatic. Similarly, trauma can lead to shame because of how people blame themselves for what happened to them, okay? And lastly, before we take our break, I'd like to just take a look at culture a little bit. So shame is not only learned in our family, it's also learned in our culture. And this is because we do not stop seeking approval when we leave the home. All cultures favor certain groups and identities and also oppress other groups and identities. This is part of culture. And cultural shame can be learned through words or actions. They could be microaggressions, they could be macroaggressions. But over time, patterns of discrimination and oppression are internalized and have a weathering effect on the human mind and body. So I think as mindfulness teachers, it's really helpful to, I presume you've done a bunch of this in your training, but we really need to get a good sense of what are our core identities and what are also some of our sub-identities, and what identities do we have that are kind of visible, and what identities do we have that are not so visible, and how did the culture treat them? Sometimes our identities are a benefit. They have benefited us, and sometimes our identities have limited us.